Hey, 42 here. The assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy in November of 1963 was one of the 20th century's most defining moments. It was one of those rare, where were you when it happened kind of events, like 9/11 and the moon landing. The President of the United States of America is one of the most powerful individual human beings on the entire planet. But for JFK, that power was taken away in a fraction of a second by the slightest squeeze of a trigger finger. But as well as being one of history's most shocking incidents, JFK's assassination is notorious for another reason. It's one of the biggest conspiracy magnets of all time. Seriously, if conspiracy theories were iron filings, the murder of JFK would be a giant slab of pure neodymium. Amongst these massed ranks of conspiracy theories is the idea that JFK was killed by a high-tech device supplied by the leader of an alien alliance. A suggestion the murder weapon wasn't a high-powered rifle, but instead a weaponized umbrella. And that Woody Harrelson's dad did it. As is the case with the vast majority of conspiracy theories, most of the alternative explanations surrounding the JFK assassination are utterly and completely mental. But unlike most conspiracy theories, the official account of what happened that day seems to be similarly far-fetched. And considering the profile of the event, we're talking literally one of the most famous things ever to happen in the recent history of our species, the sheer amount of confusion, misinformation, and subterfuge surrounding the assassination is astonishing. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. On the 22nd of November 1963, in the early afternoon, John F. Kennedy's presidential motorcade was driving through the city of Dallas. Unlike a few other notable examples, JFK was an extremely popular president for the most part, and ecstatic onlookers lined the streets just to get a glimpse of him. It was a sunny day in Texas, and earlier that morning, Kennedy had ordered his limousine's top to be left off so as to give the crowds a better view of him. I'd say that was a decision he lived to regret, but, yeah. Kennedy and his wife Jacqueline were smiling and waving as the cars trundled through Dealey Plaza on their way through Dallas. It was a beautiful, sunny, and happy day, until all of a sudden, it wasn't. It's thought 3 shots were fired in total, though some claim it was 4. At least one shot missed. One took the president high up on the back, exiting through his throat, and another struck him in the head in a blow so devastating, fragments of Kennedy's scalp, brain, and skull were later found spattered on the bonnet of the next car along in the motorcade, and on the officers riding motorcycles to either side. Kennedy wouldn't be pronounced dead for another 30 minutes, but there was never any chance he could have survived. At 1:40 p.m., exactly 1 hour and 10 minutes after the shooting, a man named Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested and charged with the murder of the President of the United States of America. He was also charged with the murder of one J.D. Tippit, a police officer Oswald had shot in cold blood in the intervening time between the president's assassination and his own capture. Oswald was taken into custody, where he was questioned several times over the next 48 hours. He strenuously denied all charges leveled against him, claiming he'd been framed. But he would never have the chance to argue his case in court, because 2 days after his arrest, whilst he was being escorted through the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters, he was shot and killed by nightclub owner Jack Ruby, who stepped out from the crowd and fired before anyone could react. TV cameras had been rolling at the time, and Oswald's murder was broadcast around America, becoming the first ever murder shown on live TV. Though Oswald was no longer around for questioning, the official story that emerged in the aftermath of the shooting was crystal clear. Oswald, acting completely alone and with no accomplices of any kind, shot and killed President Kennedy from a sniper's nest on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, which overlooked Dealey Plaza. By the way, here's a little-known piece of movie trivia for you. The specific section of Dealey Plaza JFK's motorcade was driving along when he was shot is called Elm Street. A name that's no doubt familiar to you from a certain famous horror movie franchise. And it turns out that's no coincidence. Most people assume Elm Street was chosen as the setting for the film to give off a small-town America kind of vibe. Elm Street is the 6th most common street name in the US if you discount numbered streets, with over 5,000 of them spread around the country. But in reality, director Wes Craven decided to title his seminal horror film A Nightmare on Elm Street in honor of the JFK shooting, claiming that was the spot where all innocence ended in 1963, with the loss of innocence being a key theme in the film. Oddly enough, the words Elm Street are never actually spoken in the film, despite being such an iconic part of the title. Anyway, despite Oswald's claims he'd been set up, the evidence seemed pretty conclusive. He worked at the book depository, and most witnesses agreed the shots had come from that direction. His boss testified that Oswald was carrying a long paper bag when he arrived at work that morning. At the time, Oswald had claimed it contained curtain rods, but the bag was later recovered and markings inside suggested it had indeed concealed a weapon. Oswald was a self-proclaimed Marxist with a pro-communist background and had defected to the Soviet Union 4 years prior to the assassination. He was also an ex-Marine and a proficient shot, and his actions directly after the assassination, fleeing the scene of the crime, didn't exactly make him look innocent either. So putting all of that together, it does kind of sound like an open and shut case, doesn't it? Oswald's political leanings gave him a motive, he had the expertise and the opportunity required to carry out the crime, and he was spotted carrying what very probably was a weapon to work in the morning of the assassination. The Warren Commission, a committee set up in late 1963 to piece together the circumstances surrounding the assassination, came to the inevitable conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, shot and killed the President of the United States of America. And yet, plenty of people think that version of events, which the US government has largely stuck to ever since, is a lie. Or if not quite a lie, that it doesn't represent the whole truth. And when I say plenty of people, I'm not talking about a bunch of nutters in those dusty corners of the internet usually reserved for flat earthers and lizard men lunatics. Those guys think JFK conspiracy theories are way too mainstream. No, it isn't just conspiracy theory fanatics who are suspicious of the circumstances surrounding Kennedy's assassination. A 2013 Gallup poll found that more than 60% of Americans believe the official version of events is false. And a similar poll conducted around the turn of the millennium suggested it was as much as 80% of the population. As it happens, on this occasion, that mistrust is very well placed. Why? Because we know for a fact there is at least one genuine conspiracy connected to the case. A secret plot to conceal information about what really happened before, during, and after the assassination of JFK. And this little subterfuge wasn't carried out by a person or persons responsible for the actual shooting either. No, it was a deliberate campaign undertaken by the CIA and endorsed by people in the very highest echelons of the US government. We're talking top secret documents that were destroyed, physical evidence that mysteriously went missing, and witnesses and whistleblowers who were discreetly silenced. Now, the idea that US government and CIA were involved in some kind of secret plot may sound like a big claim, and it is. But don't worry, you don't have to take my word for it, because the CIA's very own chief historian concluded that's exactly what happened in a now declassified report written in 2013. The report doesn't tell us anything much about what really happened that day in 1963, but it does confirm the CIA knew a lot more than they ever let on, and that the intelligence agency willfully withheld important information from the Warren Commission that would almost certainly have changed both the direction and the outcome of its investigations. Now, admittedly, this declassified CIA report did claim it was merely a benign cover-up, their word, not mine, designed to better represent what they considered the best truth, which was that Oswald acted completely alone in the assassination of the president. But a benign cover-up is still a cover-up, and the smoke and mirrors this subterfuge created have, if anything, only served to add fuel to this raging conspiracy theory bonfire. With a lot of popular conspiracy theories, you find yourself questioning the sanity of those naive enough to call themselves believers. I mean, how can anyone really truly think the Earth is flat? But in this case, it's exactly the opposite. You kind of have to question the sanity of those who don't think there's some kind of conspiracy relating to the assassination of JFK. After all, the CIA literally admitted to having created one. At this point, you might be wondering why the CIA was so keen to promote the idea Oswald was the shooter and that he had no accomplices. Is it possible they were trying to suppress a much less palatable truth? After all, the CIA, the Dallas Police Force, and even Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson all feature prominently in the various conspiracy theories surrounding this case. Maybe, but there are a couple of slightly less out there motives for the cover-up that are probably more likely. The first was purely political. If Oswald was acting on someone else's orders, that could have led to some very unpleasant consequences. If a foreign power had been implicated, for example, it would have been seen as an act of war, very likely forcing the US into a military response that might have had devastating implications for the entirety of the human race. This all took place smack bang in the middle of the Cold War, remember? The second reason to hide certain truths about what really happened that day is even simpler. The CIA were engaging in a spot of good old-fashioned arse covering. You see, if Oswald was a lone lunatic, as the CIA wanted people to believe, a madman who woke up in the morning and thought to himself, you know what, I don't much like that John Kennedy, then preventing the assassination would have been next to impossible. If, on the other hand, Oswald was part of a wider conspiracy to kill the president, if he had known links to groups who wanted to do both President Kennedy and the US harm, if, in short, he was blinking brightly on the CIA's radar prior to the assassination, well then, it was a truly monumental blunder on the part of the US intelligence services that the assassination was ever allowed to happen. I mean, the president's open-topped car drove directly past the guy's place of work. You'd think that might have rung a few alarm bells if it had been known Oswald was a threat. And so the now well-documented benign cover-up took place. The CIA withheld their information, and the Warren Commission went ahead without the full facts at their disposal. Their report was released in the autumn of 1964, giving the public their first opportunity to pick over the official version of events with a fine-toothed comb. And it didn't take long for people to start finding inconsistencies. For starters, witness testimonies taken in the aftermath of the shooting were kind of all over the place. 104 people heard the shots that killed President Kennedy. 52% thought they came from the direction of the Texas School Book Depository, but a substantial 32% put the shooter as standing on the now infamous grassy knoll at the side of the road, where conspiracy theorists have long speculated a second shooter may have been positioned. 9% picked a different location entirely. Skeptics have investigated the timing of events too. The weapon used in the shooting was a 6.5mm Carcano, a bolt-action carbine. According to the report, all 3 shots loosed at Kennedy were fired in around 5 to 7 seconds. Oswald was known to be a good shot, but some have questioned whether he really could have been capable of firing 3 shots with a bolt-action weapon at that speed and with such accuracy. Then there was the information reported about the shots themselves. You see, Kennedy wasn't the only man in the vehicle who was wounded that day. Texas Governor John Connally, who was sitting directly in front of the president, was also hit. He survived, but suffered a fractured rib, a punctured lung, a shattered wrist, and a bullet wound in his leg. But the Warren Commission concluded that the bullet that hit President Kennedy in the upper back and exited through his throat also caused the wounds suffered by Governor Connally. Like, all of them. If that were true, this one tenacious bullet powered its way through no fewer than 15 layers of clothing and 7 layers of skin, creating 4 entry wounds and 3 exit wounds in the process. Not to mention traveling through nearly 40 centimeters of muscle tissue, smashing 10 centimeters of Connally's rib and shattering the radius bone in his right forearm, before finally making itself at home in his thigh. Despite this ordeal, the bullet was found largely intact, just lying on a gurney in the hospital where Kennedy and Connally were taken after the attack. No one could even be sure if it was Connally's gurney. Yeah, it isn't too hard to see why conspiracy theorists sunk their teeth into that one. Skeptics refer to this Warren Commission explanation as the magic bullet theory. And they believe there's a much simpler explanation for this hard-to-believe bullet behavior. There was another shooter present that day, firing from a different angle altogether. Grassy knoll, anyone? It's worth pointing out that whilst interesting, no so-called inconsistencies in the Warren Commission's report really prove anything. Sure, it's odd that different people heard gunshots from different directions that day, but eyewitness testimony, and ear witness testimony for that matter, have never been a sure thing. And most of those who heard the gunshots didn't even recognize them for what they were at the time, with many thinking someone had set off firecrackers. It's the same thing when it comes to questions over Oswald's ability to have made those shots as quickly as he apparently did. There's no denying that if the Warren report is correct, Oswald fired faster and truer than would have been possible for most people, even experienced users of firearms. But Oswald was a Marine, and other weapons experts have been able to reproduce both the speed and accuracy he showed that day with the same weapon he used. Even the so-called magic bullet theory is the subject of a huge amount of debate. For every person who claims no bullet could have caused so much damage to 2 different people and survived to tell the tale, you'll find another equally credible expert who'll tell you that crazy shot wasn't just possible, it was exactly the outcome expected, considering the relative positions of the 3 men, Oswald, JFK, and Connally, at the time of the shooting. When the Warren Commission report was first released, its conclusions were widely believed. But as more and more voices began to call into question its findings, the government decided something had to be done. In 1976, a new investigation was launched by the House of Representatives Select Committee on Assassinations to look into both Kennedy's murder and that of Martin Luther King Jr. This new investigation took 2 years, and it came to several conclusions that differed from the Warren Commission's. The most interesting of which was that at least 2 gunmen fired on John F. Kennedy, one of whom was Oswald, and one whose identity was unknown, who probably fired from the grassy knoll. It sounded like a big step forward for conspiracy theorists, until it transpired that the key piece of evidence leading the committee to this conclusion, an audio recording taken during the assassination, had likely been misinterpreted. Unsurprisingly, these questionable findings didn't do much to quieten the conspiracy chatter. People wanted to know more, and focus soon turned to the large number of unreleased classified files related to the case. Over the years, pressure to make those files public continued to grow, bolstered by the premiere of Oliver Stone's 1991 film JFK, which ended with a message to audiences to ask Congress to release all classified records relating to the assassination. Eventually, that pressure told, and in 1992, the President's John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act was passed. setting a 25-year deadline for the release of all those documents. That deadline was reached in October of 2017, when around 3,000 files were made public. The declassified documents contained a huge amount of info, some of which was already known, some of which had long been suspected, and some of which was totally new. They also laid bare the CIA's benign cover-up for all to see. We now know Lee Harvey Oswald had indeed been on the CIA's radar in the lead up to the assassination. In fact, he'd been under heavy surveillance, with some of his phone calls being recorded and pictures taken of him outside the Soviet embassy. He also had links to Cuba, and a memo from J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI at the time, even showed Oswald had been overheard threatening to kill the US president during a trip to Mexico he took just weeks before the assassination. So yeah, it seems the US intelligence services really did have all the information they should have needed to make sure Lee Harvey Oswald was nowhere near President Kennedy on that fateful day in Dallas, let alone staring down at him through the sights of a high-powered carbine. Perhaps unsurprisingly, these revelations have done nothing to quell one of the biggest conspiracy theories of them all, that the CIA was somehow involved in the assassination. Which admittedly does seem like a bit of a stretch, but then again they weren't averse to trying to bump off other world leaders, so I guess you never know. Also released in the Kennedy files was information about several attempts planned by the CIA to assassinate Cuban leader Fidel Castro, one of which would have seen them team up with the Mafia. Speaking of the Mafia, Jack Ruby, the nightclub owner who shot and killed Oswald live on television, was known to have connections to the criminal underworld, and he murdered the one and only suspect in JFK's assassination. Ruby claimed he'd done it to spare Jackie Kennedy the ordeal of having to sit through Oswald's trial, and perhaps that's true, but some people believe Ruby had really been sent to silence Oswald before he said too much, or perhaps before he was able to prove his innocence. And that kind of thing pretty much sums up the whole sorry story. No matter which way you turn in this case, there are odd connections and strange coincidences. Examine any one aspect of the assassination closely enough, and you're likely to come away with more questions than answers. Take Kennedy's autopsy, for example. There are numerous reports from medical staff at the Parkland Memorial Hospital that suggest a large portion of the back of the president's skull was missing when the body arrived. And yet, the official photos from the autopsy show Kennedy's head was intact. Some say the wound was concealed because it represented evidence Kennedy was shot from the front and not from behind, suggesting another shooter. And others say the medical staff simply got it wrong. 2017's declassified documents did contain a few other choice bombshells, by the way, like for example the fact that a threat on Lee Harvey Oswald's life was called into the CIA the day before he was fatally shot and killed by Jack Ruby, and that the Soviets seemed to have believed Kennedy had been assassinated in a plot involving his vice president Lyndon B. Johnson, who himself suggested in later life that the hit was linked to the Vietnam War. This is normally the part of the video where I say, the plot thickens. But in this case, the plot is already a block of solid concrete so dense, it's unlikely anyone will ever be able to reach the kernel of truth hidden inside. So, are we any closer to knowing the whole truth and nothing but the truth about the assassination of JFK? No. No, we are not. In fact, I don't know about you, but I'm more confused than when I started. One thing we can pretty much say for sure is that there's more to the assassination of John F. Kennedy than meets the eye, and that the public have never quite been given the full story. That view is backed up by the fact former US President Donald Trump made a last-minute decision to withhold around 300 files that were due to be released back in 2017 after pressure from the CIA, amongst others. So, as for which of the 100 or so theories about what really happened that day you should believe, your guess is as good as mine. Thanks for watching. You can get your hands on my book, Stick a Flag in It, over on Amazon or on Audible. Links to both in the description below. Thank you.